Good evening all and welcome to day 2 of Nature Week. Tonight we're going to be heading into the middle of nowhere for a truly chilling collection of spooky stories. So get comfortable and let the darkness take control. This all happened around August of 2013, out in the desert of northern New Mexico. A mutual friend of mine called John was throwing one last huge party before heading back to university. His parents were gone for a week, leaving him in charge of their property, with a large acre of farmland. The San Juan River was running through it, and a massive mesa overlooked everything to the south. So with no parents around, he planned something unforgettable, an absolute rager. He filled animal troughs with jungle juice, which he called Dank Drank, and set up multiple DJs around the property. He even paid one of his friends to work the cattle guard gate to make sure only people he trusted came in. I went with my close friends Jacob and Sean. Later we met up with Alex, Sean's cousin, and Gabe, better known as Tank because he was 6'4" and nearly 280 pounds. This detail is important for later, so don't forget it. By sunset, the place looked like a small festival or local concert. Nothing but cars in the fields and hundreds more people, music bouncing off the canyon walls, the smell of dust, beer and weed thick in the air. We started drinking, laughing, chatting with strangers. It was a good night. Honestly, the kind you wish would never end. Except Jacob couldn't shake his paranoia. He always got nervous at parties out in the middle of nowhere. He swore the cops were going to show up. We told him to chill. This was private property, and the cops couldn't just walk in. But he wasn't wrong. The guy working the gate got drunk, passed out, and left it wide open. By 10 o'clock, the glow of bonfires and floodlights could be seen from miles away. I'd wager. Then we noticed headlights winding down the snaking dirt road. At first, we thought more guests were arriving, until those lights began flashing red and blue. Sheriffs and state police. And that's when everything exploded into chaos. People were screaming, cars revving, dust clouds rising, people running in all directions. You could hear officers shouting and dogs barking over the music. Everyone started running like headless chickens in the dark. We bolted towards the river. Tank tried to push down on a barbed wire fence so we could jump it. I went right after him, but the wire snapped back and ripped my pants clean open, leaving me in my boxers sprinting through the desert the rest of the night. Thank God it was summertime. We found cover in a dense patch of cottonwoods and brush near the water. It was so thick it felt like a cave. We crouched low, hearts pounding. All of a sudden, 2 people came tearing into the same spot, scaring us half to death. They spoke mostly Spanish, but we managed to tell them to shut up. Cállate, los cops. We could hear officers yelling in the distance. Come out. We know you're out there. Under 18. We'll call your parents. Anyone over 18, it's going to be worse if you don't come out now. Their flashlights swept through the trees, beams cutting just above our heads. The amount of adrenaline we had from running and hiding was insane. My chest was on fire. The cops were maybe 20 yards away. We could hear the radios crackling and them speaking to each other, along with the sound of their dogs barking and boots crunching through the dirt and twigs. Then behind us in the river, we heard splashing. At first it was faint, not a big deal, like someone wading through shallow water, but it got louder and heavier. Whatever it was sounded massive. I was more concerned about being caught by the cops, and figured it was someone else swimming across the river to find a place to hide. Tank whispered, "Bro, something's back there." I whispered back, "Probably a cow or something, dude, be quiet." Then came the panting, slow, deep, and strange, like a huge animal out of breath. A mountain lion, perchance? It wasn't rare in those parts, especially at night. Sean's voice cracked. I'm not staying here to get eaten. I don't care if I get arrested." Just as he said that, we heard a voice from the top of the mesa behind us shout, "It's all clear over here. You don't need to search this area." The cops turned their light towards the mesa's small overhanging cliff. One of them shouted, "Copy that," but with not much confidence. But I guess he bought it. Then, just like that, they turned and moved off. We looked at each other in amazement. We recognized that voice. It was Ryan, an acquaintance who'd climbed up there earlier to hide. I suppose in a moment of genius or total drunken bluff, he pretended to be a cop. He had literally just saved us. But the second the officers turned away, the panting behind us got louder. Ironically, our situation wasn't over as I had thought. Now, much closer, maybe 10 yards away, branches cracked, water splashed, and you could feel the weight of something big moving towards the tree line. If that wasn't enough, Sean shouted, "Screw this, I'm not dying out here. You can if you want, I'm going up there with Ryan." We broke from the cover of our branched cavern and ran up the mesa towards Ryan, scrambling over rock and cactus, tearing our hands open on the climb. When we reached the top, the lights from John's property flickered below red and blue strobes flashing across the fields. People getting arrested, others still running. In our few minutes of catching our breath and celebrating, we evaded the cops. And that's when it happened. Out of nowhere, something massive darted across the mesa in front of us, no more than 15 yards away. It moved diagonally across our view in just a second or two. Its speed was insane and frightening. This couldn't be human. This thing looked like a linebacker made of shadow. The only light source was the faint ambient light from the moon. This creature or person had huge shoulders, long arms, and ran on 2 legs with terrifying speed. It dwarfed Tank. It made him look small, and that alone was enough to freeze us and give us a sense of primal fear. We just stood there in stunned silence, listening until its footsteps faded into the open desert, the surrounding area devoid of noise beside what whispers we heard several hundred feet below us at the remnants of a dead party. Ryan laughed nervously. I think that was Bigfoot. But no one answered. We didn't wait. We climbed down the other side of the mesa as fast as we could, slipping on loose dirt and trying to be as careful as possible. At the bottom, we regrouped and said goodbye to Ryan and the 2 strangers. We tried to figure out how to get back to John's house and my truck sitting on the top of his property. To the east and northeast were the roads, but that's where the cops were still detaining people. Our only other option was to head north, looping around towards the western front of John's property. To do that, we had to climb a steep hill blanketed in cottonwood, sagebrush, and other vegetation, almost like a small forest tucked into the desert. It was dead quiet except for the crunch of our shoes on the dry dirt of the hill. And then we heard it. Laughter, high-pitched and childlike. It sounded like a group of girls giggling just ahead of us on the top of a hill. We froze. The hairs on my neck stood up instantly. Sean yelled out, but there was no reply. We waited. Nothing. It felt like years passed, but it was only silent for seconds. And then the laughter came again, softer this time but closer, seeming to be coming down the hill or even circling us. Sean shouted out again. Silence. We shined our flashlights from our iPhones up the hill, but all we saw were the shadows of brush and trees. Then faintly the giggles started one last time, again overlapping like 2 or 3 voices right at the edge of light, just beyond what we could see. I'm not sure if it was my imagination running wild, but I swear I saw 2 figures crouched atop the hill behind the trees and bushes. That was it. None of us said another word. We turned and got the hell out of there, taking the long route north through the dark until we were far from the river, the Mesa, and whatever the hell those things were. Later that night, we heard that people had restarted the party about 15 miles away. So we went to the next party and enjoyed ourselves, finally, after a crazy night. But not long after tragedy struck, we heard that Larry, one of John's closest friends, crashed his car leaving the first party, sometime between when the cops arrived and when we were running around. He had rolled his car several times and did not survive. That night will always stick with me, not just because of what we saw, because of what it reminded me about life. Partying can be fun, yeah, but drinking and driving never ends well. Rest in peace to Larry. I didn't know him personally, but everyone who did said he was kind, selfless, and the kind of guy who would give you the shirt off his back. Losing someone like that, so young, all because of one bad decision. It leaves a mark that doesn't ever really fade. I still think about all the what ifs. What if John's buddy hadn't passed out and left the gate open? What if Ryan had been alone up there when that thing showed itself? What if we hadn't run, and that creature came closer? So many questions left unanswered and still so much to reflect upon. This life works in mysterious ways, and honestly it's haunting and surreal. That night changed how I see things. We went out there just to have fun, never thinking about cops, monsters, or death. But that's how fast everything can change. Every once in a while when I'm out there near those mesas at night, I can still feel that same chill. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this story. Until then, stay safe, stay vigilant, and never stop growing. And above all, be kind. Rest easy, Larry. This happened when I was a kid around 8 years old. My little sister was 6. We lived with our parents in a very isolated place, an old house surrounded by dense forest in a rural mountain region in South Germany, with no neighbors. The closest house was more than 2 kilometers away, and at night you felt so lonely, like the world ended at the tree line. My parents went out that evening with my uncle. Just some light drinking, nothing unusual, and my sister and I stayed home alone. That wasn't a big deal for us. Our parents went out often, and we were used to it. That night, I made us some snacks and watched TV together in my parents' bedroom on the upper floor. We always liked that room, because it felt safer than the rest of the house. Big bed, thick walls, and a window that looked over nothing but forest and darkness. After an hour or two, we fell asleep. At some point, the TV turned itself off. Then in the middle of the night, I woke up to a sound that instantly froze my blood. Help! It came from outside the window, from right below the open window. I was fully awake immediately. There was no confusion, no half-dream state. But I lay there staring into the darkness, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. For a moment, I tried to convince myself I imagined it. About 20 seconds passed, and then my sister whispered, barely breathing, "Did you hear that?" That was the moment my stomach dropped. I told her I had. I said it sounded like Mum. She agreed. The voice wasn't yelling wildly, it sounded strained and desperate, almost hoarse, like someone who'd already been screaming for a long time. We lay there paralyzed, clinging to each other, too scared to move, too scared to even sit up. Then it came again. "Help!" Louder this time. Something in me snapped. I jumped out of bed and ran to the window, even though every instinct told me not to. The night outside was pitch black. The forest swallowed everything beyond a few meters. I shouted as loud as I could, my voice shaking. "Mum, are you there? Where are you?" But nothing answered. My sister asked me if Mum was outside, what she was doing there, but I didn't know what to say. Then the scream came again. The same voice, the same word, the same desperation. And I screamed back crying, "Mom, where are you? Please answer." But there was no answer. I ran back to bed. We were both crying uncontrollably. I had never felt fear like that before, real fear, the sort that aches your chest. When it happened again, I told my sister to stay in bed. I was going to get the phone. I don't know where I found the courage, but I remember running downstairs so fast my feet barely touched the steps. Every shadow looked like something waiting to pounce on me, and I grabbed the phone and ran back upstairs, heart racing so hard I thought I might pass out. I called my mum's number. No answer. Then my dad's. No answer. I hadn't heard from them since they left. Then another scream echoed through the open window. At that point, my sister and I didn't even speak anymore. We held on to each other, crying until we eventually fell asleep from exhaustion, still fully dressed and terrified. When we woke up the next morning around 8 a.m., the bed was empty. For a second, I thought it had all been a nightmare, until I remembered everything at once. Still shaking, we went downstairs. The house was quiet. No sign of the parents or of anyone being there. I told my sister to sit on the couch while I checked outside, and I went to the kitchen window and stared into the yard, half expecting to see signs of blood or a struggle. I don't know why. I was 8 years old, and my imagination was running wild. But there was nothing. There were no footprints or anything to indicate anyone had ever been there. I just looked over the forest, and we waited in silence. It was around 9 a.m. when the front door finally opened. My parents came in looking exhausted and shaken. They told us they'd been in a car accident during the night, around the same time we heard the screams. Their phones were dead, so they couldn't answer our calls. My sister immediately started telling them what happened. I already knew they wouldn't believe us. I swore it was real, that we both heard it, that it sounded like Mum. But they still don't believe us to this day. So to whoever was screaming for help outside our house in the middle of nowhere in the middle of the night, let's not meet again. And I hope you made it out okay. My father owns a large property in a remote part of Western Victoria, far from any towns most people would recognize. This isn't farmland surrounded by neighbors or dirt roads with traffic. Once you leave the main highway, it's nearly an hour of narrow gravel tracks, gates, and long stretches where you don't see another house, fence, or vehicle. Mobile reception drops out completely, and at night it's so dark you can't see your hand in front of your face. The land backs onto a wide strip of untamed scrubland that follows a slow, muddy river. The scrub is thick, tight, a tangled growth of twisted trees and thorny bushes, and tall grass that rattles when the wind moves through it. Once you step inside, visibility drops to a few meters, and everything is muffled except for insects and the occasional splash from the river. So as you've gathered from this description, it is not somewhere you wander into casually. So about 10 years ago, one of my dad's horses died out in the paddock, near the edge of that scrub. It wasn't suspicious, horses die sometimes, especially in the heat. Dad did what landowners often do in remote places. He dragged the body with his tractor towards a large gum tree near the bush line and covered it with fallen branches, dead wood, and debris. The plan was to burn it later when the conditions were right. Then life happened and he forgot. Over the years, nature took care of the rest. The horse decomposed completely, flesh vanished, tendons dried out, and eventually all that remained was bone and some bleached brittle, and slowly was buried under the leaves, stick, dirt, and more fallen branches. After a few seasons, the spot became indistinguishable from the rest of the paddock. Even Dad admits that if you ask him to point out the exact location, he probably couldn't have done it anymore. It had been a full decade. So 2 weeks ago, Dad was doing his usual checks alone. He was inspecting fences, water troughs, and gates, moving slowly across the paddock on foot. The day was quiet, with no wind or birds to be heard. As he got closer to the scrub, something caught his eye that made him stop dead. Close to the tree line about 50 meters away from where the horse had originally been left, there was something pale against the dark ground. At first, he thought it was a fallen branch. Then he realized it wasn't. Someone or something had moved the horse's remains. The skull was there unmistakable, resting on top of a pile of bones. Several of the largest leg bones had been gathered and stacked together beneath it, not scattered or gnawed, not dragged randomly, placed. The pile sat just outside the scrub, almost like a marker. Everything else, the smaller bones, ribs, and spine, was gone. Dad said the longer he stared at it, the more wrong it felt. It wasn't just that the bones had been moved, it was how. The skull hadn't rolled there by accident. It was upright, balanced. The leg bones were arranged in a way that suggested intention, as if whoever did it had stood there for a while, deciding where each piece should go. There were no tracks or boot prints, no vehicle marks. The ground around it was undisturbed, despite the fact that those bones would have had to have been carried across uneven paddock terrain. This isn't land you cross easily. There are dips, hard-packed soil, thick grass, and patches of loose rock. No one should have been there anyway. The property is locked and fenced. Trespassers would have no reason to walk that far from the road, let alone go digging through a decade-old pile of rotting debris to retrieve bones. As for animals, nothing fits. Foxes, dogs, and scavengers might chew fresh remains, but they don't care about dry bones with nothing left to eat. They don't carry heavy leg bones long distances. They don't collect skulls. And they definitely don't stack things neatly like some kind of offering. The scrub behind the pile is the worst part. That bushland feels oppressive even during the day. Dad said while standing there it felt like the silence was pressing in on him, like the sound of insects and birds had backed away. The river was nearby, but even that seemed muted. He had the overwhelming feeling that whatever had moved the bones hadn't gone far, and that it belonged to the scrub. He didn't stay long. Nothing else has changed since then, no new disturbances or explanations. The pile is still there, exactly as it was found, and Dad avoids that part of the paddock now. He still works the land, still checks fences, still goes out alone, but he doesn't linger near the bush line anymore. And honestly, the idea that something took the time to uncover, move and arrange a horse's bones 10 years after its death, out in the middle of absolutely bloody nowhere, with no witnesses, bothers me more than if they'd just been scattered. Because whatever did it wasn't feeding. It was doing something else. I just wish I knew what that was. To start off, I should say that I'm naturally jumpy and extremely aware of my surroundings. I'm not quiet or timid, and I don't go out of my way to avoid people. But I do trust my instincts. I've always had a strong gut feeling for when something is off, and I usually listen to it. I'm from a European country where serious crime is rare enough that most people don't think twice about walking alone even at night. Because of that, there's this false sense of safety baked into daily life. Still, I rarely go out alone after dark. I live in a small town surrounded by farmland and woods that stretches for miles, and those places feel very different once the sun goes down. When I'm with friends, though, I let my guard down a little bit. Last week, my best friend and I went on our usual evening walk. We've been taking the same route for years and knew it by heart. It's familiar, and we joke around and talk non-stop and never really think twice about what could happen. The first 3/4 of the walk are uneventful. There are street lights scattered, houses and the faint glow of windows in the distance. Then we reach the tunnel, the point of no return. Past it there are no lights at all. The smooth asphalt turns into a rough gravel road, and that's when we see a white van parked just before the tunnel, angled awkwardly near the deep drainage ditch. The engine is off with no hazard lights or reasons for it being there. We slow down, already uneasy, but we laugh it off. We joke about horror movies and how this is where people always get followed. As we walk past, I glance into the van and feel my stomach tighten. I am almost certain I see the outline of someone sitting inside, too still to be convincing. I mention it quietly. My friend snaps at me annoyed, telling me to stop scaring her. We pass through the tunnel. On the other side, the path curves left and climbs uphill. There's no moon that night, just a solid wall of black. And once we reach the top, the land opens up into nothingness. Dense woods pressing in on one side and a massive hop field on the other, stretching out into the dark. No sound, except the buzzing of insects somewhere unseen and the crunching of gravel under our shoes. We walk like that for maybe 5 minutes, talking about nothing important. And that's when headlights bloom behind us. At first it doesn't alarm us. Farms are scattered miles ahead, and the occasional vehicle will of course pass through. We step aside, slowly letting it go by. But it doesn't. We glance back again, and my chest tightens immediately. It's the same white van. It's moving desperately slow, and close enough that its headlights cast our shadows long and distorted across the road. But we keep walking, pretending everything is normal. But the distance between us and the van never change. About 50 meters. We speed up, the engine revs. We slow down, so does the van. And that's when we realize with ice-cold clarity that this van is following us and keeping the same distance. I bump my friend's shoulder, looking straight in the eye, and say 3 words. Run to the field. Now. We both left, straight into the hop fields, not caring where we were going. The ground was uneven, torn up into high pieces of soil, and we nearly fall several times, heart pounding so loud I swear that they could hear it. Finally, we drop behind one of the larger dirt mounds and press ourselves into the ground, barely daring to breathe. The van stops. The headlights snap on full power, flooding the field with harsh white light, and 2 men, both wearing hooded jackets and their face hidden in shadows, step out, each one holding a flashlight. They begin scanning the field methodically, beams cutting through the darkness, sweeping closer and closer to where we're hiding. The light passes over a mound of dirt feet from us, and I can hear my friend try not to sob. Time stretches. Seconds feels like minutes. Then without a word they return to the van. We hear the engine splutter to life, and the vehicle turns around right there on the narrow road and drives back the way we came, vanishing forevermore into the darkness. We sprint through the field, legs burning until we reach the edge where the houses begin again. Only when we see porch lights and fences do we slow down, shaking and breathless. I don't know who those men were or what they wanted. I've never been followed like that before, and I hope I never am again. I went to a small college tucked away in rural southeastern Ohio. The town basically ends at the campus and everything beyond it is just forest. When I was still in school there, a group of friends and I decided one night to go looking for an abandoned rail tunnel deep in the woods. The tunnel had a reputation, local legends, ghost stories, the usual stuff, but nothing we took seriously at the time. Around 10 p.m. one night, so dark the sky looked empty, someone said, "Let's go find it." By 10:45 p.m. we were driving out of town, further and further until the streetlights disappeared completely. We didn't know at the time that there was a proper parking lot and a bridge that led almost directly to the tunnel. Instead, we trusted one friend who swore he knew another way. We parked several miles down a narrow, barely maintained road beside what used to be a railroad track, now just a cracked gravel path swallowed by weeds and trees, no houses or lights, no noise except the wind and the insects. We followed what looked like a walking track until it abruptly ended near a vertical embankment, close to nearly 90 degrees. There was no trail down, just loose dirt. And against our better judgment, we still climbed anyway, sliding and grabbing branches, trying not to fall. At the bottom, we reached a shallow stretch of a creek, the water cold and unnaturally still. We crossed it laughing nervously, still convinced we were just dumb late-night adventurers. For a while, we wandered aimlessly, checking our phones at the time and using them as flashlights. We expected to stumble onto the tunnel or at least see something strange like graffiti, old tracks or anything. But instead, around midnight, we walked into something I still don't know how to explain. The trees thinned, and we found ourselves in what looked like a narrow canyon or bowl in the land. And everything inside it was dead. The trees stood bare and grey like they'd been burned from the inside. And the sound of small animals and insects and wind did not seem to permeate this bowl. No other sound could be heard, save for the crunch of our footsteps. The ground was littered with animal corpses, small mammals, birds, some fresh, some old enough to be unrecognizable. Nothing moved. One end of the canyon dropped off a steep cliff at least 35 feet straight down into dark. We didn't see what was at the bottom. We couldn't. The air felt thick, and I remember realizing my ears were ringing because it was just so quiet. None of us joked anymore. We didn't stay long because every instinct was screaming at us to leave. When we finally climbed out the area, it felt like stepping through a doorway. And instantly sounds came rushing back. Insects, birds, wind in the leaves. The forest was alive again like nothing had happened. We all stopped and stared at each other, trying to process it. Someone joked that maybe it was just our imaginations, but no one really believed that. We figured we'd been gone maybe half an hour, and then we checked our phones, and it was almost 3 a.m. Our batteries were nearly dead from using them as flashlights, and panic started to set in. We all knew what time it was supposed to be. The so-called witching hour. On top of that, the area had a reputation for old cult activity, and rumors of rituals being performed deep in those woods years ago. Whether any of it was true didn't matter. In that moment we were lost, disoriented, and very aware of how alone we were. We tried pulling up maps, but there was no service. One by one the phones started dying, flashlights blinked out. When we were down to a single phone with just a sliver of battery left, we followed the faint outline of a path, and somehow stumbled onto a one-lane gravel road. Within minutes, by pure luck, we found our car parked exactly where we'd left it. We didn't celebrate, we just got in, locked the doors, and got the hell out of there. Later on, I learned that local legends say a creature often described as a goat man supposedly lives near the top of the tunnel. I can't say we encountered anything like that, but after what we experienced, it didn't seem as improbable as it had before that night. I've only been back once since, and only during the day, after finding out about the bridge and proper access point. But seeing the area in daylight didn't make that night feel any less real. The first route we took, that canyon and the dead place in the woods, I've never gone back to it, and I don't plan to. Whatever we walked into that night didn't feel natural. I was born and raised in the US, but my mother grew up in South Africa and immigrated in the 90s. Because of that, my childhood was shaped by rules that other kids didn't have. Be alert, to not trust silence, and to never assume you're safe just because a place looks peaceful. Something as mundane as using an ATM at night became a coordinated operation. While my mum withdrew cash, I had one window, my sister had the other, eyes up, heads on a swivel. At all times. I thought she was paranoid. And later I learned that she was just preparing us for the bleak reality that is adulthood. So when I was 17 and received a trip to South Africa as a graduation gift, I was excited but not naive. I stayed with my grandparents, both well into their late 70s, who lived on a quiet property far from any city. My grandmother was determined to show me as much of the country as possible, and within days we were on the road. We left Johannesburg heading towards Cape Town, sometimes driving 5 or 6 hours at a stretch. Anyone who's travelled through South Africa knows how deceptive the landscape can be. Mile after mile of nothing, flat grassland, distant hills, endless sky, no towns or houses, just the long, long road. It was breathtaking and deeply unsettling. As we reached the outskirts of Cape's wine country, the scenery shifted and vineyards appeared, stretching far back towards the dark tree lines. Hand-painted signs popped up along the road. Do not stop for grape sellers, keep driving. My grandmother explained that people would steal grapes from the vineyards and sell them on the roadside. She said it casually like it was harmless, but the warnings told a different story. Several hours into the drive, tension filled the car. The GPS began malfunctioning, repeating the same phrase over and over. Recalculating. It wouldn't lock onto our route, and the arguments grew sharper. We were hot, tired, and clearly lost. Finally, my grandmother pulled over. The road was narrow, barely wide enough for 2 cars to pass. Dense trees pressed in on both sides, their branches forming a sort of tunnel. And despite it being mid-afternoon, the light felt unusually dim. We were completely alone. While my grandparents leaned forward arguing over directions and maps, my grandmother suddenly turned around to look at me. "Watch the back window." It then hit me how instinctive it was, how natural it felt. I nodded without question, the way my mother had trained me to. I checked my phone, no service, not even emergency signal. I opened my camera roll and scrolled aimlessly, trying to ignore the tight feeling in my chest. And then I looked up. A man had just stepped out the trees. At first, my brain struggled to understand what I was seeing. He wasn't walking, he was sprinting straight towards us at full speed, arms pumping, eyes locked on the car. There was no road behind him or no reason for him to be there, and I screamed to my grandparents, "Go!" My grandmother didn't hesitate and floored it. The tires screamed against the pavement as we surged forwards. In the side mirror, I saw the man slow to a stop, standing in the road, watching us drive away. He didn't chase us. He stood there, and we didn't speak for several minutes. When my grandmother finally broke the silence, her voice was shaking. She told me that travelers who pulled over in that area were often targeted. One person would act alone, selling fruit, asking for help, or simply waiting, while others stayed hidden in the trees, and once a car stopped, they rushed it. People were beaten, robbed, and sometimes left to die. A year earlier, a tourist couple had stopped on that same stretch of road. They were later found, fortunately alive, but hospitalized, their car stripped and abandoned not far from where we had pulled over. And we drove the rest of the way without stopping once. That night, lying awake at my grandparents' house, I realized something terrifying. If my grandmother hadn't trusted her instincts, if my mother hadn't drilled caution into me from a young age, if I had have hesitated for a second longer, we would have been struck on the side of an empty road miles from help, with no signal or witnesses or way out. So to the man who came running out of the forest in the middle of nowhere, let's not meet. A few years back, a buddy and I found out about a natural hot spring high up in the mountains of eastern Oregon. Not the kind with a parking lot and a sign. This one was barely mentioned on old forums and vague trail maps. You had to drive nearly 2 hours past the last real town, then crawl along a washed-out dirt road that felt like it hadn't seen maintenance since the 90s. After that, it was a steep hike, up a narrow trail that disappeared into thick timber. We decided to camp there for a few days in late winter, which in hindsight was probably a bad idea. Snow was already creeping down the slopes, daylight was short, and once the sun dropped, the temperature plummeted fast. There was no cell service at all, not even a flicker. We had set up camp at the trailhead just before dusk. The place felt completely cut off, and while we were making dinner over a small fire, headlights appeared on the dirt road behind us. A single car pulled in, which honestly surprised us. We hadn't seen a vehicle all day. 4 people in their early 20s got out. All of them were already dressed in swimwear despite the cold, and wrapped in hoodies and sandals. No backpacks or towels from a first glance, and they seemed relaxed, laughing quietly, like this was a normal after-school stop, instead of a brutal winter hike in the middle of nowhere. They waved at us as they passed, friendly but distracted, and headed straight up the trail towards the hot spring. After they disappeared into the trees, my buddy and I exchanged looks. It struck us as odd, but not enough to say anything. We figured they were locals who knew the area better than we did. A few hours went by, and by 6 p.m., it was already getting dark. The forest went silent. We grabbed a bottle of scotch, strapped on headlamps, and started our trail ourselves, fully expecting to run into the group soaking in the springs. When we reached the hot springs, immediately something felt off. The water was steaming in the cold air, completely undisturbed, but we couldn't hear any voices, laughter, or movement around the pools. But we could see sandals were scattered haphazardly along with towels and a few hoodies, like they'd been dropped in a rush. The stuff looked fresh, still dry in places where frost should have started to settle. We joked nervously that maybe they all wandered into the trees to pee or mess around. Still, we called out a few times, but nothing echoed back. All that we could hear was our own voices and the sound of the water. We got into the springs. For 2 hours we soaked and talked occasionally, scanning the tree line, but no one ever came back. We couldn't hear any footsteps or voices, no flashlight beams cutting through the woods. The longer it went on, the quieter it felt. By the time we headed back down to camp, it was close to 1 a.m. The cold hit hard once we left the water. When we reached the trailhead, the car was still there, exactly where it had been earlier. Frost had now formed on the window, but there were no lights or signs of anyone returning. That night, neither of us slept well. When morning came, the car was gone. Not just the car, everything. No towels or sandals or clothing left behind at the spring when we hiked back up to check. No footprints in the snow that made any sense. It was like the 4 of them had never been there at all. To this day, we have no idea what they were doing up there, where they went, or how they left without us seeing or hearing anything. The fact they vanished sometime during the night in sub-freezing temperatures without gear, without tracks, and without a sound bothers me. We packed up early and left that morning, and neither of us have been back since. Last night, my boyfriend and I were heading home and got a flat tire. This was around midnight, and we were on a highway, so we immediately got off an exit in the middle of nowhere, and he got to changing the tire. It was dark. The only light we had were the headlights and our phones. I was very paranoid, and kept telling my boyfriend I heard things and felt weird because it was so lonely. But we shook it off with me just being paranoid. The whole time we were there, I felt so anxious, but my boyfriend was trying to calm me down so he could just change the tire and leave. I was on the lookout with my flashlight the whole time. Finally, about 30 minutes of being out there, he was finished with the tire. He told me to put something up in the car, and as soon as I went back to him, he began yelling at me to get in. I immediately jumped in and was in full panic mode. The whole car was moving from the trunk, and I heard loud banging. I kept trying to look back and forth to see where my boyfriend was, and if I saw someone, but honestly it's such a blur I can't even remember most of it anymore. Thankfully, my boyfriend immediately comes in the car and we rush out of there. He proceeds to tell me that he heard a whistle from a thorn bush just in front of us, as if someone were beckoning him. And that's when he saw jeans and a body figure right behind it when he heard the whistle. And that is when he immediately picked up the flat tire and was forcing it in the trunk. We were terrified, and still are because we were at that location for 30 minutes. So I don't know if it was a person just standing there staring at us the whole time, but also if there was, why wouldn't they have done something by then? I wish I looked out, and when we left to see if there was any movement, or if I saw anyone, but we were just in full panic mode, and he had literally chills running down all over his body. My boyfriend did say he was forcibly closing the trunk, and he had a crowbar and didn't see anyone come out, but it was fast and a blur, and he didn't exactly see anything else. I truly do believe he saw something because he felt like it was a life or death situation, and his body took a screenshot. We aren't sure what that whistle was, but we are thankful nothing happened, and are definitely never stopping in the middle of nowhere in the night again. A friend said it could have been his guardian angel looking out for him with that whistle to leave immediately, but it was certainly the most scary experience we've ever had. Around 20 years ago, I was visiting my grandmother in a small village just outside of Aldershot in the UK. The private street where she lived barely qualified as a road at all. It wasn't properly surfaced and was full of deep potholes and uneven ground. There was only one way in or out for vehicles, at the bottom of a long slope. At the top end of the street were woods you could walk straight into, which bordered an active army training ground. The area felt isolated even during the day. Historically, the street had once been the access road to an old workhouse, the kind you'd recognize from something like Oliver Twist. The building itself had long since been demolished, but it left behind filled-in underground structures beneath where my grandmother's house was later built. Being a private road, there were no street lamps at all. At night, the only light came faintly from the high street, far below, and a few weak house lights scattered along the slope. One night at around 9 p.m, long after sunset, I went out to sit in my car with a colleague to have a smoke. We were parked facing down the unmade road towards the single dim streetlight roughly 300 yards away. As we sat there chatting, I noticed a dark, humanoid shape walking slowly uphill towards us. It was dressed in what looked like a full monk attire, long robe, hood up, face completely hidden. I now compare it to the classic image people associate with death. My colleague saw it too. I didn't have to say anything before he reacted. Instinctively, I turned on the car's headlights to see who it was. The light washed over the road, and there was nothing there. No person or movement, just an empty street. Feeling uneasy, I turned the headlights off. Almost immediately, the same figure reappeared in the darkness in the same position, still approaching us. And this time we could hear crunching footsteps on the gravel road. We panicked and ran from the car towards the house. As we sprinted, the sound of footsteps followed closely behind us, fast and heavy, matching our pace. We slammed the front door shut behind us and stood there, breathless. The moment the door closed, all sounds stopped. No footsteps or background noise. All we could hear was silence. Inside the house, the temperature noticeably dropped, even though the heating was turned up. Neither of us dared go back outside. We eventually went to our separate rooms and tried to sleep, but neither of us managed to rest until sunrise, when we both heard whispering and slow footsteps moving through the house, As a final note, that house always felt busy in an unsettling way. There were frequent cold spots, unexplained whispering and the sound of footsteps, along with the constant feeling of being watched. After my grandmother passed away, at her wake, even though around 6 people were present in the house, it felt completely different. As if some sort of invisible weight had now been lifted. When I was younger, I used to horseback through remote stretches of Northern California for weeks at a time. This was in the late 1970s and early 80s, long before GPS or satellite phones. It was just maps. I almost never used a compass. I carried one, sure, but I relied on maps and dead reckoning instead. I've always been good at navigating by landmarks, ridge lines, distant peaks, the way valleys fold into one another. And in all those years riding and camping in places most people never set foot in, I was never truly lost except for once. So let me take you back. I was deep in a national forest along a coastal range, heading generally south towards a sparsely populated county that barely shows up on most maps. This wasn't a place with trails every few miles or signs nailed to trees. It was isolated, rugged terrain, dense bush that clawed at you and your gear if you let your guard down. The kind of country where a broken leg would mean no one would ever find you. I stayed high on the ridges moving south and looking for a reasonable place to cross into the next drainage when it made sense. The sky that day was partly clouded, the light oddly flat. The temperature hovered around 60 Fahrenheit, usually cold for early August when daytime highs were normally well over 90. Even my horse seemed uneasy, ears flickering at sounds I couldn't quite place. Eventually I spotted what looked like a manageable crossing in the next ridge system and started down. From above it seemed straightforward enough. Once I committed though, it became clear I'd misjudged it badly. The ravine was choked with slick stone and broken rock. The footing treacherous for hooves. I dismounted and led my horse, picking my way through the ravine, hoping to find a safer exit. And that's when the wind came. The temperature dropped fast, and a light drizzle started falling. It was just enough to darken the dust and make everything slick, and I walked for at least a mile, scanning both sides of the ravine for a way out, but everything looked too dangerous or steep, especially for my horse, and I didn't want to run the risk. Reluctantly, I turned back and began climbing the slope I had originally come down. When I reached the top, I expected relief, but instead I froze. The world was wrong. The ridgeline was still there beneath my feet, but everything beyond it was different. Not subtly different, completely alien. The landmarks I had been navigating by distinctive peaks, distant ridges visible for dozens of miles were gone. Not obscured or shifted, but gone, replaced by unfamiliar shapes and angles that made no sense. I felt my stomach drop. I pulled out my map, forcing myself to slow down and think. I checked bearings, elevation contours, and nothing lined up. The hills I should have been seeing weren't there. The valleys were wrong. The only thing I could identify with certainty was the ravine I had just climbed out of. The clouds thickened overhead, flattening the light even more. The wind strengthened, cutting straight through my jacket. It got colder, far colder than it had any right to be. I remember thinking irrationally that snow didn't feel impossible. And for the first time in my life, I had no idea where I was. With no sun to guide me and no recognizable landmarks, I made the only decision that made sense. Backtrack to the last place I knew was real. I started back down into the ravine, heart pounding, scanning the ground carefully for my earlier tracks. As I descended, something shifted again. The rain stopped, the wind faded. The air warmed as if someone had turned a dial. When I reached the bottom of the ravine, I found my original path without difficulty. I followed it back up the slope, still half expecting something to change beneath my feet. When I crested the ridge this time, everything was back. Every landmark, every distant peak, every ridgeline exactly where it should have been. I stood there in silence, trying to make sense of it. I continued along the ridge, watching closely for the spot where I had descended earlier. Where I reached where it should have been, there was nothing. No trail, no sign of disturbance, no obvious way down. I searched back and forth for a while, but found nothing that matched what I remembered. Eventually I moved on. Not far ahead I found an easy descent, and an equally easy way back up the opposite ridge. Exactly the kind of crossing I'd been looking for earlier. I took it and continued south, but I never shook the feeling that something had watched me leave. To this day I can't explain what happened. Even with the drizzle, I should have seen nearby landmarks. The distant ones were massive, impossible to miss under normal conditions. And thinking back, there was no sign of rain or cold when I later passed the area where I'd first descended. The temperature swings that day were extreme, 30 to 40 degrees, but wildly out of character for the place or season. But there's one detail that still bothers me the most. Originally, I chose that descent because I could clearly see there was nothing blocking my way up the other side. Yet when I arrived, the slope was clogged with boulders, huge ones, that I absolutely should have noticed from above. At the time, I was too focused on survival and navigation to dwell on it, but now, decades later, thinking back on that stretch of empty wilderness, it feels deeply wrong, not just disorienting. Like for a short while, I stepped somewhere I wasn't supposed to be, and it barely allowed me to leave with my life. Last summer, I quit my job as a professor. My husband and I rented out our house, and we used that income to move into the woods of southern Oregon in our fifth wheel. My husband has a solid job, and I freelance. And one of the ways I contribute to the household is by working as a camp host 3 days a week at the RV park where we live in exchange for free rent and utilities. Most of my job is making reservations, but it also means I get to spend time outside talking to other residents and travelers. There have been a few strange and unsettling things that have happened since we moved here, and I wanted to share them. I don't see many RV park stories shared, so I was hoping others might have experiences of their own. Our park is deep in the woods, truly in the middle of nowhere. A steep hill covered in dense, almost impenetrable trees rises on one side of the property, and a river runs along the other. At least 3 times a week, we hear what sounds like someone playing a flute or recorder for an hour or more at a time. Sometimes the music seems to drift from deep within the forest, and other times it carries across the river. The sound is unmistakable. When I mentioned it to a long-time resident called Pat, who had lived here since 2004, she immediately told me to ignore it and not to speak of it. Then there's a scraping sound I hear at night about once a week. It sounds like something being dragged slowly across the ground through the park, heading towards the woods. My husband has heard it too, but no one else seems to notice. What makes it even stranger still is that when the sound happens, the Ring camera in the office sends an alert saying someone is standing on the porch. But the problem is, the camera never actually picks anyone up. I have the sensitivity set so it only triggers if someone is standing directly on the porch, because I hate getting alerts every time a car drives by. We also get late-night phone calls pretty regularly from people looking for last-minute spaces to stay the night. I usually take their credit card over the phone and direct them to the site using a map so I don't have to leave my trailer after dark. The park owner, called Debbie, made it very clear that she doesn't want me helping late arrivals in person at night. In fact, she has a strict rule that we are not allowed to answer the phone at all between midnight and 6 a.m. When I was talking to Pat about this rule, she made a comment about how careful camp hosts need to be about who they invite to the campground, which felt a little ominous. There are other odd things too. I'm responsible for approving long-term residents when spaces open up, and part of my job is reviewing their application, which includes their employment, the size and age of their rig, and other details. While children are welcome for short visits, no one with kids is allowed to move in on a monthly or yearly basis. Debbie has never given me a clear explanation as to why. The park itself was built by a woodcarver, and the property is covered in massive, strange totems, sculptures, and intricately carved doors and figures. Some of them are beautiful, others unsettling. Despite all of this, our park really is a slice of heaven. I love taking my dogs down the river to swim, watching wild mushrooms grow after the rain, and listen to the sound of storms with only a thin roof between us and the sky. I also feel genuinely safe here. I'm becoming more open to the idea that the woods are just strange sometimes, and I don't always have to understand it. About 3 years ago in September, my friend called Agatha and I drove up the southwest base of Mount Hood to view planets with her new telescope. We often go to national forests for stargazing or night hikes. We are both experienced woodswomen. She's been a long-time camper, and I'm a wilderness survival guide. We've both spent long periods of time in the wilderness. Both of us have had bear encounters, cougar encounters, wolves, elk, moose, you name it. I've also had my fair share of strange encounters with other people in the forest, from stumbling upon occult rituals to people living off the grid. But those are all stories in their own right. All of this is to say that neither of us are spooked easily, and are very used to the diverse sights and sounds of the forest. Agatha had been to the spot where we were heading to before. It's a dispersed campsite off a medium-used Forest Service road. We wanted to go to this particular spot because we knew it was high enough elevation that we'd lose a lot of light pollution, but not so high we'd run into snow. It was a decent spot for stargazing within about 150-foot diameter clearing that was mostly dirt and gravel. Though Agatha had been there before, I never had, and I wanted to drive a bit further up the mountain to see if we could find a slightly less treed view. We drove for another few minutes up the road. Along the way, I spotted a tent about 60 feet off the right side of the road, at what looked like another dispersed campsite. The odd thing was there wasn't a vehicle parked at the site, just another tent. Another odd thing was that it was pretty cold to be camping in a standard 2 to 3 season cabin-style tent. Night temperatures that time of year, at that elevation, were around 30 to 40 Fahrenheit, and that night, it was about to get to 36. When I pointed this out to Agatha, she slowed down a bit to check it out. I was concerned maybe someone had left the tent, and if so, we would take it down and dispose of it properly. So she slowed to about 5 miles an hour, and I briefly shined a light towards the tent, but not directly on it in case someone is in it and asleep. In the 10 seconds it took for us to slowly drive by, it looked like the tent wasn't fully zipped up, and I could see through the mesh door. It also looked like it was improperly assembled. We didn't think much more about it and kept driving. We said we'd check the tent to fully determine if it's dumped on our way back down. We drive maybe another minute or two when the road narrows severely as it curves on an incline. We are both used to sudden changes like that, because Forest Service roads are known to be wily. But for whatever reason, Agatha comes to a full stop before taking the curve and says, "I don't think we should go any further." I say, "Okay, well why?" And she says, "I don't know, but I'm turning around and going to the spot we originally came here for." I was slightly concerned because she sounded a bit upset, but I chalked it up to her just being excited to finally use her new telescope. She reverses about 50 feet and turned the truck around to head back to the clearing. As we approached the spot where the tent was, I took off my headlamp and handed it to Agatha so she could shine it out the window on her left side of the road towards the tent. The weird thing is, it seemed like it had moved 30 to 50 feet down the road. It just didn't seem like it was in the same spot as before. Once we saw it to the left of the headlights, she came to a full stop on the road right in front of it. What was even creepier is that it now seemed to be much closer to the road than it was before. But since I wasn't thinking too much about it the first time round, I just assumed it was one of those fallible eyewitness memory moments and let it go. But I could only let it go for about 5 seconds. I don't know what came over Agatha, but she decided to shine the headlamp at full blast directly on the tent. I said, "Whoa, wait a minute. We still don't know if there might be someone sleeping in there." But as soon as I looked at the tent, I ceased. I stared at it for a good 10 seconds before I said, "What are we looking at? Is that a tent?" Agatha said, "Yeah, I think so. It's just upside down." I blinked my eyes a bunch, thinking perhaps the cold air had caused them to water and it was messing with my vision. I stared at it for another 5 seconds, and I don't know how else to explain this, but it looked like I was staring at a Picasso painting of a cabin-style tent. Nothing was where it was supposed to be. I looked away for a few moments, thinking I should have brought my glasses and couldn't believe my night vision was suddenly so poor. At this point, I noticed a feeling of uneasiness creeping up on me, but I shrugged it off. I asked Agatha if she saw anyone in the tent. She looked for a few seconds to answer me and said, "Dude, to be perfectly honest, I don't know what the hell I'm seeing, but yeah, I think I see someone's bare legs sticking up in the tent." My heart went straight to my throat, and I immediately thought, oh no, someone is in fact inside and they're either dead or dying of exposure. Then Agatha whispered, "What is that?" I looked towards the tent again, and for a split second it almost looked like there were in fact someone's bare legs sticking up, as if they were in a cot in the dead bug position with slightly bent knees. But this was through the mesh part of the tent door, so I couldn't make it out fully. I blinked my eyes because for whatever reason the damn tent was hard to look at. And when I opened my eyes, in that millisecond of blinking the mesh door was closed and the legs were now gone. This whole time it still looked like a Picasso painting, and I began to get a headache because it felt like my brain couldn't reconcile what we had seen, though it was a seemingly ordinary object. It was so disjointed and out of proportion and seemed to shift every time I blinked. Agatha started mumbling, "What the hell?" every few seconds, and then she just suddenly shook her head, rolled up the window and said, "Let's just go. Someone is probably sleeping in it." I have no idea why she came to that conclusion or why I went along with it, aside from the fact it was the only reasonable explanation at the time. We've both experienced out-of-the-ordinary things in the wilderness, so while this was definitely strange and caused us both to be on higher alert, we didn't panic and we rationalized the weirdness away. But of course, that didn't last long, because this night was determined to be strange. We left the tent, and whoever may or may not have been sleeping in it, and we pulled into the gravel clearing 5 minutes down the road. We both put on our headlamps and scoped the area for trash and critters. The first odd thing to happen at this area is that while we were at the edge of the clearing, Agatha almost fell to the ground on her face. What's weird about this is the fact that she's an avid outdoors woman. Lots of experience walking at night on and off trails. The same thing happened to me. As I walked from the edge of the clearing back to where we'd set up a tarp and blankets, I tripped and almost fell backwards. This happened to both of us about half a dozen times more, tripping over nothing and tripping over our own feet. It almost felt like the ground wasn't where it was supposed to be. Rationally, I could say everyone has off days, and in my case, I hadn't even been there before, but she had, and she was familiar with the area. And I routinely visit new places many times, and I don't recall ever tripping and stumbling like this outside of treacherous terrain or creek walking. So I don't know, make of it what you will. Again, we brush off the weirdness, and she goes about setting up her telescope. I lay down on the tarp while she tries to get Jupiter in view. She spends maybe 3 minutes setting up the telescope, and about 30 minutes trying to lock in on Jupiter. Every time she gets it lined up in the scope, and takes a moment to stand up straight, so all of 3 to 5 seconds, she would bend down to the eyepiece again and Jupiter would be gone. That whole time I was laying on the ground on a tarp, with a crocheted blanket draped over me, perfectly comfortable. I didn't notice just how comfortable I was until she asked me to come over again and look through the scope to see if I could help keep Jupiter in sight. As soon as I stood up, I noticed a temperature change from where I was laying down. It was suddenly way colder. Not like a wave of cold air. The air was still. It was like the temperature on the ground was a good 15 degrees warmer than the ambient temperature. I also couldn't keep a bead on Jupiter, and after about another 5 minutes of trying, we gave up and laid down on the tarp for some simple stargazing. After chilling out for a few minutes in silence, I realized Agatha didn't have a blanket, so I asked her if she'd like to share mine. She respectfully declined, saying she wasn't that cold. But this was odd, because she's one of those people who is always cold. So for her to decline a blanket was just another check for the list of anomalies that night. I mentioned to her that I noticed a change in temperature from about 10 to 12 inches off the ground. I wish I had thought to put my hand directly on the ground to feel if it was hot or cold, but at the time none of this was registering as a red flag or something to pay much heed to. As I was staring up at the sky, which was perfectly clear, I noticed that it was split in two, running east to west. The best way I can describe it is there was an invisible line demarking half the sky into the north and southern section. The northern side was somehow lighter than the southern side. It almost looked like the northern side was affected by light pollution, whereas the south was not. But it gets even stranger. As soon as I noticed the split sky phenomenon, I also noticed the stars on either side were twinkling at different rates. As soon as I noticed the stars, the split reversed. The south was now lighter and the north darker. I pointed this out to Agatha. She watched for a while and confirmed she saw the same thing happening. We chalked it up to some unknown natural phenomena. I have yet to set a solid answer of how this happened. It wasn't a light pollution dome or a light dome of any kind, because this demarcation was stark and not at all diffused or fuzzy. The sun had set at least an hour and a half earlier, so it wasn't a twilight wedge either. It could also not have been due to an anti-crepuscular ray, because we were facing west. I would love for a meteorologist to weigh in on this. Another 10 minutes passed. I was so comfortable, I felt like I would fall asleep. In fact, I was starting to close my eyes when Agatha suddenly sat up and shook me. She said she saw a light coming from approximately where the Picasso tent was, through the tree line to the southwest. I didn't bother sitting up, and just turned my head to look in that direction. I asked if she thought it was a flashlight, and she said maybe, but it seemed too high off the ground. I said it probably was the person who was staying in that tent, and maybe they just got back from a late-night hike or going to the bathroom. She agreed and laid back on the top again. Some time passed. I lost track of the minutes, and as I was starting to doze again, I guess anywhere from 10 to 20 minutes, I was lulled into a light sleep, when suddenly I sat up bolt upright. Agatha was still lying down and appeared to have fallen asleep herself. There was no noise. Nothing discernible woke me. I looked towards the tree line to the southwest and saw a light. For a split second, I was congratulating myself for having such sharp senses that I could tell when someone was walking with a flashlight that far away. But that faded quickly when I noticed another light and another. I had one of those moments where my mind couldn't piece together what I was seeing, and I couldn't match it to anything I'd seen before. There were a total of 3 lights or orbs. I wasn't seeing beams of light emit from a flashlight. I was seeing orbs of light floating independently through the upper half of the tree canopy towards us. They were maintaining a triangular formation, but were rotating one around another. They had a bluish hue, kind of like a cheap LED sun lamp. I couldn't say for certain how large they were, because I had no frame of reference aside from the tree line, which was about 50 feet away from where I was sitting. But the orbs were not directly at the edge of the clearing. They seemed to be much further away. I could tell they were coming towards us, as they appeared to be getting slightly larger as I stared at them. I shook Agatha and pointed towards the tree line. She turned her head in that direction and shot up fast. She grabbed her telescope and I stood up and wadded up the tarpon blanket. We threw everything into the bed of her truck without putting the telescope back in its case or anything, and floored it out of there. I have never felt the kind of dread that I felt on the mountainside that night. I was in full fight or flight mode, to such a high degree it felt like I wanted to run while in the truck. The panic was so awful that my breathing was erratic, and my hands went numb for a few minutes. We didn't speak until we got fully out of the forest and onto Highway 26. Once we saw another car passing in the opposite direction, we both sighed with relief and started in a bunch of WTFs. To this day I don't have any answers. It was such a bizarre mishmash of innocuous occurrences. Each thing on its own was barely strange, but I can't help to think that the temperature change, the ground being wonky, the Picasso tent, and the split sky was somehow related to seeing the orbs. Then again, it's the brain's job to try and make sense of everything, even when there's nothing to make sense of. Our panicked reaction and shared sense of dread was also very strange and out of character for both of us. It was a sudden, visceral reaction. It felt like there was something else at play to make both of us react that way. Hopefully someone here has some insight on potential rational explanations. Otherwise, I just guess it's aliens. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I do hope that you enjoyed tonight's narrations. I certainly had a lot of fun narrating these stories for you all. If you liked this, you might enjoy the Mort Bedtime Stories podcast, which is a podcast where we basically do this. It's on Spotify and Apple Podcasts and all those places. So if you want to check it out too, you can do just that. If you'd like even more bonus content, feel free to check out my Patreon, where I've just published some stories for free. So if you want a bit more, feel free to go listen to that at your leisure. But that's it from me. One final thank you to my members and patrons whose names can be seen on screen. Their support and dedication really means the world and goes a hell of a long way. And if you would like cool perks for joining, follow the links to find out more. Stay awesome, guys, and I'll see you in the next one. Good night.